Early winter of 1892 settled over the mountain valley, and the first snow dusted the jagged pines like powder on dark green velvet. The air carried a sharp chill that hinted at the coming severity of the season. 18-year-old Elias Mercer moved deliberately around his small homestead, stacking rough-hewn boards and inspecting the worn timbers of his cabin. He had begun a task that drew immediate attention and subtle ridicule, building a second roof over the original structure. To neighbors, the effort seemed excessive, even absurd. If you wish to follow the unfolding story of Elias Mercer and his winter preparations, viewers may quietly like, share, or subscribe. From the ridge above, the county assessor, a stoic man in his 50s named Thomas Keene, observed Elias's labor with a raised brow. "That roof will gather snow, not keep it out," he muttered to a nearby farmer, who shook his head in quiet agreement. Across the clearing, a handful of settlers paused in their own preparations for the winter, exchanging low whispers about the young man's strange choice. Their laughter was soft, almost cautious, but it carried enough to reach the ears of anyone who paused to listen. Elias ignored the murmurs. Each plank he lifted was measured, each beam positioned with care, and his hands bore the fine calluses of years spent in timber and stone. He worked slowly, knowing that speed could mean mistakes, and mistakes could mean a breach against the mountain's harsh winter. His small dog, a wiry black terrier named Rufus, padded around his legs, occasionally barking at the drifting snow. The animal's alertness mirrored Elias's own. Every gust, every shift of cloud was a warning. The valley itself was uncompromising. Pines bent under the early snow, rocks jutted through frost-hardened soil, each one a potential hazard. Winds funneled through narrow passes, carrying with them the scent of frozen streams and distant evergreens. Elias's decision, while mocked, was a preemptive measure against this very environment, a buffer against forces that did not bend for human doubt. By midday, the first layers of the second roof were in place. Its angle was subtle, calculated to allow snow to slide gradually rather than accumulate in a heavy slab. Small gaps were left intentionally to ventilate the cabin, a precaution learned from observing older settlers whose roofs had failed under similar loads. Each movement was deliberate. There was no haste, no dramatic gesture. Only the methodical application of skill honed through years of necessity. Neighbors drifted back to their own cabins, glancing over their shoulders at Elias as if measuring his persistence against their assumptions. Elias Mercer, for all his youth, displayed a quiet resilience that only became visible when contrasted against the hurried or careless work of others. There was no boast in his manner, no words to the doubters. The work itself was his statement. Even as clouds darkened and the wind picked up, the valley seemed to hold its breath. The snow's first heavy flake drifted lazily from the sky, landing softly on the half-completed roof. Elias paused for a moment, hand resting against a beam, feeling its firmness and the subtle flex under pressure. The gesture was not triumphant, but measured, almost ritualistic, a silent acknowledgement of the land's impartiality. Until the storm came, this work would remain unnoticed, doubted, and quietly mocked. But the valley and its winter were patient, and they remembered. The morning after Elias began his work, the valley's usual quiet was punctuated by the muted creak of wagons and the distant sound of axes chopping firewood. The county assessor, Thomas Keene, made his routine rounds, examining the small cluster of homesteads that lined the river bend. He paused at Elias Mercer's cabin, observing the second roof with a critical eye. "That seems an unnecessary labor," he said to the farmer standing beside him, nodding toward the cabin. Time spent there could have shored up the barn or reinforced the stock pens. The farmer, Samuel Whitmore, scratched at his beard. "Aye, young Mercer has the hands, but not the sense to save them for what counts," he replied. Their voices were practical, not harsh, yet their tone carried skepticism. Other neighbors passing by exchanged quiet glances, measuring the effort against the coming winter's known severity. The valley, at first glance tranquil, held undercurrents of doubt that spread quietly like frost along the ground. A small crowd gathered at the edge of the clearing, including Martha Galloway, an elderly widow whose own cabin leaned perilously against the slope. She said nothing, yet her presence lent weight to the scene. She watched Elias methodically nail planks and brace beams, each movement deliberate, each measurement precise. The pauses in his work were spent inspecting joints and ensuring the alignment of timber. Though silent, Martha's observation acknowledged care and experience, even if she refrained from comment. The wind carried a faint whistling through the pines, and a single branch scraped the roof edge. Elias continued undeterred, hammering with steady strokes and adjusting the boards with the practiced hand of someone accustomed to working with the land. His dog, Rufus, padded around the periphery of the worksite, occasionally barking at a falling twig. The scene was methodical, almost ritualistic in its repetition, showing labor as its own proof rather than any verbal defense. Near the beginning of this observation, the narrator pauses briefly. A single moment for viewers to like, subscribe, or share if they wish to follow the unfolding story. The pause is quiet, neutral, and without emphasis, a calm acknowledgement of the narrative rather than a call to action. Neighbors drifted back to their own tasks, some glancing over their shoulders, others returning to chopping wood or tending animals. Their doubt lingered, not as derision, but as measured observation. Elias, in contrast, maintained his focus on the second roof, each board and beam asserting a quiet argument against the valley's skepticism. The structure grew slowly, an unspoken testament to foresight, patience, and preparation. By late November, the valley's weather patterns began to shift noticeably. Light flurries fell most mornings, melting in the sun, but leaving traces that spoke of the season to come. Elias Mercer noted these changes with practiced observation. The black-capped chickadees altered their flight paths, moving closer to the cabin for shelter, while deer tracks deepened in the frost, indicating heavier snowfall higher on the ridges. Even the wind carried subtle warnings, changing direction in ways that suggested gusts would soon intensify along the slopes. Elias worked with precision, adding layers to the second roof he had begun. He positioned each plank to allow a narrow gap beneath it, forming crude ventilation channels intended to prevent moisture from gathering in the upper timbers. He measured spacing carefully, aligning beams to distribute weight evenly. With a hand-worn mallet, he tapped joints into place, the dull sound punctuating the quiet valley. Every movement was deliberate. Nothing was left to chance. The structure grew slowly, methodical, and precise, though the observers from the neighboring homesteads continued to question its purpose. The cold bit through mittens and coat sleeves, drawing occasional breaths of visible vapor from Elias's lips. He paused periodically to observe the drift of early snow against the first roof, noting its thickness and the pressure points forming near the eaves. Rufus, his terrier, followed along the roof's edge, cautious but alert, slipping on frost-hardened boards before regaining balance. The young homesteader adjusted boards that had shifted under wind gusts, testing stability with measured steps. Across the clearing, the neighbors murmured among themselves. Samuel Whitmore shook his head, commenting softly, That boy will tire himself before the snow comes. Such effort seems wasted." Martha Galloway watched in silence from her cabin door, her gaze steady but unreadable, registering the care evident in Elias's work without offering judgment. Even the assessor, Thomas Keene, remained skeptical, remarking only on the unusual angle of the upper roof. Dialogue remained brief, practical, and focused on observation rather than conjecture. The wind shifted again, carrying with it a faint scent of frozen river and pine resin. Snow began to settle more consistently in the higher reaches, dusting the ridges and forming small drifts along the valley floor. Elias adjusted the positioning of boards to respond to these subtle environmental cues, ensuring the second roof could bear the added weight. Each layer reflected a calculated response to natural signals: wind patterns, snow accumulation, and animal behavior, all considered without haste. By late afternoon, the roof had taken clearer shape. From a distance, the valley's other residents could see the framework rising above the original structure, yet its purpose remained opaque. The careful gaps for ventilation, the overlapping planks, and the measured angles of the beams suggested thoughtfulness, but they could not yet convey the value that would soon become evident. Elias Mercer continued with patient persistence, responding only to the land and the approaching season rather than to the doubts that lingered across the clearing. By late evening, the first true signs of the blizzard arrived. Snow fell steadily, not in sudden gusts, but in a consistent, relentless sheet that reduced visibility across the valley to near whiteout. The ridges and familiar landmarks disappeared beneath a uniform layer of white. The wind, previously a gentle herald of winter, gained weight and persistence, rattling the exposed timbers of cabins and sending loose shingles spinning across the frozen ground. Elias Mercer monitored the shifting conditions carefully, noting the strain on his own roof even as he retreated indoors to conserve energy. The storm's progression was measured and precise. Flakes swirled in circular eddies, layering atop one another until paths were obscured within minutes. Trees bent under the pressure of accumulating snow, and the sound of branches snapping punctuated the dull roar of wind through the pines. The valley became a confined, almost suffocating space. Familiar fences and markers vanished, leaving the homesteads isolated and indistinguishable from the surrounding wilderness. Inside his cabin, Elias adjusted the upper planks of the double roof as he could, listening for creaks or settling that indicated stress. The structure shifted subtly under the weight of snow and ice, but the timber held firm. Rufus pressed close to the stove, shivering, while Elias checked the joints one final time before tending the fire. The effort required constant vigilance. Any lapse could allow snow to breach the cabin's defenses. The cold gnawed at exposed skin and seeped through layers of wool, yet the young homesteader moved with measured care rather than haste. Outside, the other residents struggled against similar conditions. Samuel Whitmore's barn roof sagged ominously, forcing him to hammer and brace under near whiteout visibility. Martha Galloway remained close to her hearth, observing her property as best she could, unable to intervene against the storm's full force. Thomas Keene noted the shifting drifts from his window, recognizing in the silence between gusts the precise danger that had been under discussion for weeks. Dialogue was minimal, limited to brief, practical observations exchanged when one neighbor's path crossed another's briefly in the snow. The blizzard extended its grip through the night, compressing hours into a tense, continuous span. Snow fell evenly across the valley floor, wind swirled around corners, and timber groaned under cumulative pressure. Every sound, from the whistle of wind through cracks to the subtle shift of beams under weight, became a marker of endurance. Elias Mercer paced lightly across his cabin, checking the roof's support, adjusting boards where necessary, yet never hurrying, knowing that careful persistence was the difference between survival and catastrophe. As the night deepened, the valley seemed suspended in a state of quiet tension. Snow accumulated silently on every surface, and structures strained under the weight. Inside his cabin, Elias Mercer remained vigilant, aware of the unforgiving winter outside, yet confident that the methodical work of previous weeks would carry him through until dawn. The storm's passage was unceremonious, exacting, and relentless, a measured trial that would reveal the merit of preparation rather than the drama of spectacle. Through the early hours of the night, snow accumulated relentlessly. Roofs across the valley bore increasing weight, and several smaller cabins creaked under the burden. One neighbor's lean-to collapsed with a muted crash, sending a cloud of powdery snow across the yard and leaving its occupant, Samuel Whitmore, scrambling for shelter. The wind carried the sound briefly, then swallowed it in whiteout silence. Elias Mercer observed the pressure on his own structure, noting how the second roof above his cabin distributed weight across the older beams. It shifted imperceptibly under the snow's mass, but it did not fail. Elias was not alone in vigilance. Martha Galloway, the elderly widow, had been moved to the Mercer cabin earlier as the storm intensified. She huddled close to the hearth, wrapped in blankets, while Elias checked the roof's timbers and made minor adjustments. Rufus, the terrier, padded along the periphery, alert to each gust that rattled the boards overhead. Elias paused to reinforce a particularly stressed joist, placing additional scrap planks to support the load. His movements were careful, deliberate, and guided by observation rather than speculation. Through the night, other community figures sought refuge in the Mercer cabin as the storm's severity became evident. Thomas Keene, the assessor, arrived briefly, noting the strain on surrounding structures, then retreated to the interior for warmth, murmuring only practical instructions to Elias on clearing snow from vulnerable points near the eaves. Snowdrifts pressed against the cabin walls, rising nearly to the lower windows, and the wind's gusts caused faint but audible shifts in the double roof. Each sound was a reminder of the storm's weight and precision. Outside, the valley's usual markers were gone: snow-covered fences, paths, and rocks alike. Trees leaned under the cumulative pressure, some losing branches to the relentless wind. The Mercer cabin, however, remained intact. Its second roof absorbed the load silently, and each plank and joist proved the careful foresight embedded in weeks of preparation. The functionality of the double roof revealed itself only through consequence. Where other structures bent and cracked, Elias's shelter endured, a quiet testament to methodical labor. Time passed in compressed hours, each measured by shifts in snowdrifts, the settling of timber, and the occasional creak that demanded immediate attention. Elias adjusted support beams, cleared minor accumulations from the roof's lower edge, and kept watch over the occupants inside. Martha Galloway's breathing was steady but shallow, and Rufus remained alert, sensing each change in the storm's rhythm. The cabin became a singular point of stability within the chaos, the double roof serving its purpose without demonstration, relying on structural integrity and careful design alone. By the approaching dawn, the blizzard showed signs of retreat, though its weight on the landscape remained. Surrounding cabins bore scars of strain. Some partially collapsed, others warped under the snow's pressure. Elias Mercer's structure, however, stood firm. The consequences were clear without the need for explanation. Preparation, foresight, and careful work had carried the occupants through the storm, while others endured damage and uncertainty. Each detail, from reinforced joists to calculated ventilation gaps, had contributed silently to survival. First light arrived with a pale, cold clarity. The blizzard had withdrawn almost imperceptibly, leaving the valley coated in a uniform layer of snow. The landscape was quiet, the usual sounds of birds or livestock suppressed beneath the heavy blanket that pressed against fences, roofs, and trees alike. Elias Mercer emerged from the cabin doorway, surveying the aftermath with methodical attention, noting how the storm had altered drifts, bent branches, and accumulated in pockets against walls. The damage across the valley was immediate and visible. Samuel Whitmore's barn had partially collapsed, its roof sagging under weight that Elias's second roof had borne silently. Fences were obscured by drifts, and the paths connecting cabins were indistinguishable from open fields. Trees that had survived the night leaned at angles, some losing branches to the weight of ice and snow. Each observation was quiet, factual, and recorded in the mind rather than spoken aloud. Elias's own cabin, however, remained intact. The double roof had absorbed the brunt of the storm's pressure, distributing weight evenly and allowing snow to settle without breaching the interior. Small gaps between the layers had prevented moisture buildup, preserving the timber beneath. He moved along the perimeter, inspecting beams and joints, noting minor shifts but finding no structural failures. Every check confirmed the foresight embedded in weeks of labor, the silent proof of preparation. Thomas Keene, the county assessor, approached from the ridge. His face was composed, expression neutral, but his gaze traced the intact roofline with unmistakable acknowledgement. "It has held," he said plainly, pausing before continuing on his rounds. No apology was offered for prior skepticism, and no praise was given. The statement was factual, measured, and sufficient. The evidence stood on its own. Neighbors began to emerge cautiously, assessing their own losses against the Mercer cabin's resilience. Martha Galloway stepped outside, brushing snow from her shawl, observing the young homesteader's work without comment. Samuel Whitmore surveyed the remnants of his own structure, noting the contrast in quiet reflection rather than spoken frustration. The valley itself remained unchanged, indifferent to human effort, yet clearly illustrating the consequences of care, foresight, and methodical labor. Inside the cabin, Elias checked the stove and secured firewood. Rufus pressed against his legs. Calm after the storm, and the small group of residents remained subdued, their attention divided between the immediate tasks and the lessons evident in the surrounding damage. No celebration occurred. The morning proof was clear through observation, not exclamation. The double roof, constructed against doubt and the unknown pressures of winter, had demonstrated its purpose silently, efficiently, and conclusively. The following days were occupied with repair and assessment. Snow continued to lie in uneven drifts, and wind had stripped thin layers from some roofs, while leaving others laden with ice. Samuel Whitmore and neighboring settlers worked steadily, shoring up weakened timbers and clearing accumulated snow from gable ends. Tools scraped against frozen wood, and occasional creaks signaled the gradual recovery of damaged cabins. Elias Mercer remained focused on his own homestead. He moved along the edges of the second roof, checking for loose boards and minor shifts, making small adjustments where necessary. He offered no instruction to others beyond practical responses when asked, nor did he dwell on the performance of his cabin. Each action was calm, measured, and unobtrusive, allowing the results of labor to speak without embellishment. The double roof drew attention quietly. Neighbors inspected its structure, measuring gaps, noting angles, and discussing its practicality in practical terms. Samuel Whitmore leaned against the porch railing, examining the overlapping planks. "These gaps might help with moisture," he observed, voice low and factual. Martha Galloway ran her hand along the exposed beams, nodding at the careful placement. "It is done well," she remarked simply. There was no celebration, no dramatization, only acknowledgement grounded in experience. Thomas Keene walked the perimeter of the Mercer cabin, observing the roof's integrity against the backdrop of other structures partially repaired or replaced. He noted the calculated support beams, the ventilation channels, and the uniform alignment of the boards. The assessment was factual and silent. Evidence noted without commentary, a record of the difference careful preparation could produce. The valley, in its enduring quiet, allowed the observation to stand as proof. Over the course of the week, a subtle shift occurred in the community's tone. Where doubt had once lingered, measured consideration now took its place. Conversations among settlers included practical questions about angles, board spacing, and load distribution. Elias Mercer did not participate unless directly approached, yet his work influenced the decisions of others, who applied what they observed to their own cabins. Through routine chores, firewood hauling, and roof reinforcement, the community's attention moved from skepticism to cautious respect. The results of labor, demonstrated silently through consequence rather than proclamation, guided practical discussion. The storm's damage remained evident across the valley, yet the Mercer homestead stood intact, illustrating the merit of methodical foresight without need for elaboration. Decades later, the valley remained largely unchanged, its ridges and forests indifferent to human presence. A local resident, Jonathan Pierce, recalled the winter of 1892 with measured detail. He described the storm as precise, unyielding, and silent, the kind that revealed the merit of preparation over opinion. Pierce noted how Elias Mercer's cabin had endured while others suffered, the second roof quietly performing its function without announcement or demonstration. The memory of that winter persisted in discussions among settlers. New cabins incorporated layered roofing and deliberate ventilation channels, not out of admiration for cleverness, but out of respect for forethought and restraint. Jonathan Pierce described visits to Elias's homestead years later, noting that the double roof remained intact, the timbers sound, and the structure standing as a subtle record of endurance. Each plank, each measured gap, served as practical evidence of the benefit of preparation rather than chance. Pierce recalled conversations with neighbors long after the event. Samuel Whitmore had remarked on the value of careful observation and methodical labor. Martha Galloway's quiet acknowledgement of the design's practicality had persisted, and Thomas Keene's factual, unemotional recognition remained part of the oral record. These exchanges had no flourish, no praise. They were the measured testimony of experience, registering merit in outcomes rather than statements. The valley itself offered no judgment, only the continuation of cycles and seasons. Winters followed in rhythm, and storms arrived with impartial precision. The land rewarded restraint, observation, and practical labor, and Elias Mercer's actions became a benchmark silently referenced whenever snow began to accumulate on newly constructed roofs. Jonathan Pierce's recollections emphasized this continuity, showing how one winter could shift practice across an entire community without ceremony, demonstration, or declaration. In reflection, the witness described Elias's choice not as ingenuity, but as preparedness. The second roof remained a quiet guidepost for future settlers, a record etched in timber and consequence rather than narrative. Even years later, the valley demonstrated the principle that careful observation, deliberate action, and restrained labor, produced results that survived the test of time, while opinion alone left structures vulnerable and communities reminded of the land's impartial exactitude.